His name was James Callahan, and the first thing anyone noticed about him was not the height, though he had plenty of it, not the squared shoulders or the perfect stillness he could hold for hours without a single muscle betraying him. The first thing people noticed was his eyes. They were the kind of gray that changes with the weather, and they moved the way a hawk's eyes move, slow and total and missing absolutely nothing. He had grown up in a small town in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, in a stone house that sat at the foot of a hill that went green in spring and brown in winter and stayed stubbornly, beautifully green in his memory forever after. His mother had kept a garden that smelled of rain and lavender. His father had served. His grandfather had served before that. When James was 7 years old, he had pressed his small hand against his grandfather's Irish Guards uniform hanging in the wardrobe and felt something move through him that he could not name but would spend the rest of his life chasing. Duty was the word, though duty is a small, clean word for a large and complicated thing. He was 18 when he enlisted. He was 22 when he first stood at Buckingham Palace in full ceremonial dress with a bearskin hat making him 6'7" and the London sun doing its modest best overhead, and, he thought, standing there in that courtyard with his rifle and his absolute stillness, that he had arrived somewhere that mattered. The Irish Guards are not what most people imagine when they picture a ceremonial regiment. Yes, there is the pageantry, the bearskins, the precision marching, the parades that stop tourists in their tracks and make grown adults cry in the street without quite knowing why. But, inside that ceremony is a fighting regiment with a history that stretches back to 1900, formed by Queen Victoria herself in recognition of the extraordinary courage shown by Irish soldiers during the Second Boer War. The men of the Irish Guards, known throughout the British Army as the Mix, had fought in the trenches of the First World War and the beaches of the Second, in the Falklands and in Afghanistan. They were soldiers who happened to wear beautiful uniforms on certain occasions. James understood this from the beginning. He trained hard. He absorbed the history of the regiment like a man drinking water in a desert, not because he was told to but because it ran through him and made him feel he belonged to something larger than himself, something that had started before him and would continue long after him, and that his job was simply to hold the line steady while he was there. He was 25 when he first saw Prince William up close. Not at a distance, not behind a barrier with 1,000 other necks craning and 1,000 phone cameras raised, but close enough to see the slight tension in the prince's jaw and the easy way he held himself in a uniform that looked like it had been made for him specifically, which it had. William had been colonel of the Irish Guards since 2011, appointed by his grandmother Queen Elizabeth II just 2 months before his wedding to Catherine Middleton, and the regiment had taken to him the way regiments take to someone who does not pretend to be something he is not. He asked real questions. He remembered names. He showed up to things that were not photographed and did not seem to need anyone watching him do the right thing in order to keep doing it. James had heard this about him before he met him. He was glad to find that what he had heard was true. The first time James was assigned to close personal security during a royal visit to the regiment, it was an ordinary Tuesday in a way that no Tuesday involving princes is ever quite ordinary. There was a ceremony at Victoria Barracks in Windsor, a presentation of long service medals to men who had given decades to the Guards, men whose faces had the particular weathered quality of people who have stood in wind and heat and rain for so long that the weather has become part of their faces. James stood where he was told to stand. He watched. Prince William moved through the room the way he always did at these events, not rushing but never hovering either, a kind of forward momentum that looked relaxed but covered ground. He crouched down to speak to a retired guardsman who was in a wheelchair, eye level, not towering over him, and stayed there for 5 minutes while the rest of the room pretended not to notice how moved they were. Catherine was not there that day. James had seen her at previous events, always standing slightly behind William at regimental occasions back then, in her early years as a royal, learning the rhythms, watching how things were done. She had been at the St. Patrick's Day parade in 2012, the year after her wedding, and James had watched her hand out shamrocks to the men with a kind of quiet attentiveness that struck him even then. She was not performing. That was the thing. You could tell the difference, after enough time inside the machinery of royal events, between someone going through motions and someone who was actually present, actually paying attention, actually registering the person in front of them as a real person with a real life. Catherine registered people. She looked at them like their faces contained information she was genuinely interested in having. James spent the next several years doing his job. Which is to say he stood where he was told to stand and he watched and he never stopped paying attention. The Irish Guards rotated through postings and deployments and ceremonial duties, and James moved through all of it with the particular steadiness of someone who has found his place in the world and is not anxious about it. He was promoted. He earned commendations. He became the kind of soldier that younger soldiers watched without knowing exactly why they were watching him, sensing in his posture and his composure some kind of instruction they needed but had not yet been given. In the years between 2011 and 2022, the Irish Guards and the Wales family became something like a family in their own right. Not the intimate kind, not the kind where you know each other's arguments and bad moods and breakfast preferences, but the kind that comes from shared ritual and genuine mutual regard. William took his colonelcy seriously in the way that the regiment always hoped and sometimes feared their royal colonels would not. He came to St. Patrick's Day every year and stood in the cold March air and received his shamrock and spoke to the men and went home with the scent of beer on his uniform and a warmth in him that the men could feel. Catherine came with him most years, and in those years, James watched her move through the tradition of shamrock presentation with increasing ease, the way someone grows into something they were always going to be. She stopped looking like a guest and started looking like she belonged. The regiment noticed. Regiments always notice these things even when they don't say them out loud. The world outside the regiment was not always kind about Catherine. James was not a man who spent much time reading newspapers or following the particular sport of public commentary on the royal family, but a person would have to be extraordinarily determined in their isolation not to absorb something of the volume and temperature of what was being said. She was too thin or not thin enough, too formal or not formal enough, too much of a clothes horse or not interesting enough on her own without the clothes. She smiled too much. She didn't say enough. She came from too ordinary a background to understand what she was entering, or she was too ordinary to find interesting now that she'd entered it. James listened to none of this with any patience. He had watched Catherine in real situations, in moments no camera caught, in the fraction of a second between a guardsman finishing a sentence and her response beginning, and what he saw there was a woman of considerable intelligence and total sincerity who had made a decision to give herself to this work and was giving herself to it entirely. There was a moment in 2016 that James would carry with him for the rest of his life. He was not supposed to be there, or rather he was there in his official capacity, present but invisible in the way that good protection officers are always present but invisible, standing near enough to the tour proceedings at the Salam Baloch Trust's contact center in India that he could do his job without being in anyone's way. William and Catherine had insisted on coming without their usual full security presence, a decision that had generated significant internal anxiety and that James understood completely even as he respected it. The charity provided support for street children and working children living in the harshest possible circumstances, and the presence of a full security apparatus would have changed the nature of the visit, made it an event to be managed rather than a genuine encounter. So they had come quietly, and James was one of a small number of people tasked with making sure that quiet visit remained safe. He watched William sit on the floor with a group of children and lose himself entirely in a game of carom, the wooden disc sliding across the board, the children laughing at his technique, William laughing too in the unself-conscious way he laughed when he thought no one important was watching. He watched Catherine sit with a young girl who could not have been more than 9 years old, a girl with a wariness in her eyes that came from having learned early that the world was not reliable, and he watched Catherine's whole body orient toward that girl, the slight forward tilt, the lowered voice, the patience that was not performed patience but actual patience, and he watched the wariness in the girl's eyes ease incrementally until it was not gone but it was less. James was a hard man to move. He had stood next to grief and ceremony and history for enough years that he had developed the ability to hold emotion at a certain distance while he worked. But watching that child's face in a crowded room in Delhi while a princess from another world sat and simply refused to stop paying attention, something in him gave. He did not speak about this. There was no protocol for speaking about it. He went back to his posting and stood where he was told to stand and kept his eyes moving and his face composed, and he stored the memory in the place inside him where the most important things lived, alongside his grandfather's uniform and the smell of his mother's garden and the particular sound of the regiment's drums beginning at the start of a parade, a sound that never failed to make the hairs on his arms stand up no matter how many times he heard it. In 2022, everything changed for the Irish Guards in the way that royal things change. which is to say it was both sudden and completely the result of long, slow processes that had been building for years. Queen Elizabeth II died in September, ending the longest reign in British history, and the ripples of that passing reorganized everything. King Charles III ascended to the throne, and, in the reorganization of royal colonelcies that followed, Prince William became the colonel of the Welsh Guards, which was right and proper given his new title as Prince of Wales. This left the Irish Guards without a royal colonel. The regiment had been William's for 11 years. They had grown used to him. Losing him felt, in the way that institutional losses always feel to people who have given their working lives to an institution, like a small grief layered inside the larger grief of the nation. And then, in December 2022, King Charles made an announcement. Catherine, Princess of Wales, would become the 11th Colonel of the Irish Guards. She was the second most senior woman in the royal family now, behind only Queen Camilla, and the king had given her this appointment as a mark of both that status and his trust in her. James heard the news the way you hear news that you have been half expecting without knowing you were expecting it. There was a rightness to it that settled in him alongside the surprise. She had been attending the regiment's events for 11 years. She had stood in the cold on every St. Patrick's Day that circumstances permitted. She had handed out shamrocks with her own hands and spoken to the men and remembered things about their families and asked about their children. She had not been their colonel and she had behaved like their colonel for over a decade. The official handover happened on St. Patrick's Day 2023, at Mons Barracks in Aldershot, in the cold, specific way that March in England insists on being cold regardless of the calendar's insistence that spring has technically arrived. William gave a speech to the regiment he was leaving. He spoke of what the years had meant to him, of the families he had come to know, of the pride he felt watching the regiment carry out its duties with the combination of professionalism and humanity that he had come to regard as the Irish Guards' particular signature. He spoke with the warmth of someone saying a genuine goodbye to something he loved, and then he turned and spoke directly about his wife, and what he said about her was not diplomatic language or ceremonial filler but something that sounded true because it was true. In Colonel Catherine, he told the regiment, "You have a committed, focused and already incredibly loyal 11th Colonel." The regiment applauded. James stood in his position and felt the particular full-chest feeling of a moment being exactly what it should be. Catherine spoke after her husband. She was wearing a teal-green coat dress that should have been too bright for a grey morning in Aldershot but was somehow exactly right, and the heirloom Irish Guards brooch, a gold shamrock that had been worn by the Queen Mother and Princess and before it came to her, sat at her lapel in a way that looked not borrowed but belonging. She praised Colonel William with the affection of someone who has watched a person do something difficult and genuinely well. She spoke of her enthusiasm for the regiment and her commitment to the work ahead with a directness that was not rehearsed enthusiasm but the real kind, the kind that comes from having actually prepared, from having thought hard about what the role meant and what she intended to do with it. James listened to every word. So did every man in the regiment. When she finished, the senior guardsman stood and proposed a toast to Her Royal Highness, and the sound that came up from the men was not the polite sound of ceremony but the loud and uncomplicated sound of genuine feeling. James Callaghan had served for 15 years by this point. He was 33 years old. He had been in Afghanistan and he had stood guard at Buckingham Palace and he had watched kings and queens and princes and prime ministers move through the spaces he protected, and he had learned through all of it to tell the real from the performance, the person from the position. Standing in that barracks yard on a cold March morning in 2023, watching his new colonel receive the cheers of her regiment, James understood something that he had been slowly understanding for years. Respect, the real kind, is not given at the beginning. It is not given because of a title or a ceremony or an appointment. It is earned in thousands of small moments that accumulate so quietly you almost don't notice them happening until one day you look up and realize that what you have is not obligation but devotion, and you cannot quite point to the single moment when one became the other. He stood straight. He kept his eyes moving. He did his job. And, in the cold bright morning of a new chapter, the Irish Guards cheered for their colonel with the whole of their considerable lungs, and James Callaghan thought, with a completeness of feeling that surprised even him, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. There were things about serving the royal family that the public never saw and never would. Not secrets in the dramatic sense, not the kind of hidden things that later become headlines, but the ordinary texture of royal life that exists in the spaces between official engagements, the moments of genuine human feeling that occur when the ceremony pauses and the people inside it are briefly, actually themselves. James had accumulated a collection of these moments over 15 years. He kept them like a man keeps good stones he has found on a beach, not for any particular purpose, just because something in them is worth keeping. He kept the memory of a young girl's face easing in Delhi. He kept the memory of Prince William's unguarded laughter over a carom board. He kept smaller things too, a nod from a princess who saw him standing his post in the rain and registered him as a person rather than a fixture, a moment at a long St. Patrick's Day parade when the cold had become genuinely serious and Catherine had passed him with a glance that said she noticed and that she thought it mattered that people were standing in this cold for something worth standing in the cold for. He thought about what it meant to earn respect. His grandfather had told him once that a man's reputation was not what other people said about him but what they said about him when he wasn't in the room, and that the only way to build that kind of reputation was to do the right thing when no one was watching with the same care and attention you brought to doing it when everyone was watching. James had applied this to his own life and found it useful. He was now watching someone apply it to a life that was watched almost entirely, that existed almost entirely in front of cameras and crowds of people who had opinions about every hat and every expression and every word and every silence, and he found that the principle held even at that scale. What Catherine did when the cameras were rolling and what she did when the cameras were not rolling were the same thing. That sameness was the most remarkable thing about her. The year 2023 was her first year as Colonel of the Irish Guards. It was also the year that James was assigned to a more senior position within the regiment's ceremonial duties, which meant that their professional proximity increased. He was present at more of her engagements with the regiment. He watched her at St. Patrick's Day, where she had graduated from the role of colonel's wife distributing shamrocks to the role of colonel distributing shamrocks, and the transition was seamless in a way that suggested it had been building toward this for years, which it had. He watched her meet the veterans of the regiment, old men with old hands and the particular dignity of people who have given a significant piece of themselves to something larger, and he watched her listen to them with the full weight of her attention, not the half attention of someone waiting for the conversation to be over but the real attention of someone who understood that what these men were offering her was not just stories but trust. He watched her with the mini-mix, the junior cadets from Northern Ireland, young people whose connection to the regiment was as much about community and identity as it was about soldiering, and he watched her get down to their level, in terms of body language if not literally, and speak to them about the regiment's history with the enthusiasm of someone who had done the reading and found it genuinely interesting. These were not performances. A performance cannot be sustained across a long afternoon of individual conversations with people who range in age from 15 to 85. What James was watching was a person who had decided that every single person in front of her deserved her actual presence, and who delivered that actual presence reliably, without fanfare, as a matter of principle. He thought about his grandfather's garden. He thought about his mother's garden. He thought about the green hills of County Antrim and the stone house and the uniform and the wardrobe, and he thought about the long chain of people who had served and what they had served and why, and he felt the answer settling in him like something he had always known but needed enough time and enough experience to recognize. You served because some things were worth serving. Not the pomp. Not the pageantry, though the pageantry had its own kind of beauty that he had never quite been able to dismiss. You served because there were people in those roles who were worth the service, people who understood that the service ran both ways, who gave as much as they received, who took seriously the weight of what they were being trusted with. He had known this in the abstract for 15 years. He was knowing it concretely now. That transition, from knowing a thing abstractly to knowing it in your bones, is something that happens in the presence of evidence, and James Callaghan had been accumulating evidence for years. January 2024 arrived in the way that January in England usually arrives, grey and cold and with the particular quality of light that seems to have given up on being cheerful and settled into something more honest. James Callaghan was 34 years old and had been a member of the Irish Guards for 16 years, and his life had a shape and a rhythm that he had come to trust the way you trust a road you have walked so many times that you know every slope and bend without having to think about where your feet are going. He went to work. He did his job. He stood in the places he was told to stand and watched with the eyes that missed nothing and kept the stillness that looked like lack of feeling but was actually a discipline of feeling, a decision to channel everything into readiness rather than expression. He had a flat in London that smelled faintly of the rain that came through a window that didn't quite close properly. He ran 5 miles every morning in the dark before the city woke up properly. He called his mother on Sundays. His life was good. He knew it was good because he had seen enough to know what good looked like. Then, the news came through on a January morning, as news of that kind always comes, suddenly, and without adequate preparation. The Princess of Wales had undergone planned abdominal surgery at the London clinic and would be recovering for up to 2 months, absent from all public duties. That was all that was said initially. That was all that was released. James heard it the way he heard most things about the royal family through official channels, as information rather than feeling, registered and filed. But he was human, and humans feel things even when they are very practiced at managing those feelings, and what he felt when he heard that news was the kind of low, unremarkable worry that accumulates quietly, that does not announce itself but changes the temperature of things slightly, the way a cloud changes the temperature of a field without anyone having to point to the sky and explain what has happened. The weeks that followed were strange. The regiment continued its duties. St. Patrick's Day was approaching, the first one in which Catherine would be present in her official capacity as colonel, her first opportunity to take the salute and distribute the shamrocks and stand before the regiment not as William's wife but as their own commanding officer, and then, that day came and she was not there. She was still recovering. She had written a letter to the regiment, a genuine letter, full of warmth and regret and the particular kind of dignity that comes from acknowledging a difficulty without being consumed by it, and the Irish Guards shared it and the people who saw it responded to it with a combination of sympathy and respect that James watched from a distance and recognized as real. The letter was not a form letter. She had written it herself. The regiment could feel the difference. The months of her absence were months of silence and speculation in the world outside, a world that James observed with a kind of professional wariness. The speculation became its own weather system, large and loud and moving quickly, and inside that weather system there were currents of concern and currents of something darker and less defensible, the particular appetite of certain corners of public life for the suffering of people who stand in the light. James was not an angry man by nature. He had a steady temper and a long patience. But, watching some of what was said about a woman who was recovering from surgery and trying to do so with some measure of privacy made him feel something that was adjacent to anger, a tightness in the chest that did not quite resolve. He did his job. He stood where he was told to stand. He kept the feeling contained in the way that years of training had taught him to contain it, and he moved on. What he could not move away from, entirely, was the knowledge of what that absence meant inside the regiment. The Irish Guards are not a sentimental institution. They are a military regiment with a history that includes some of the worst violence that the 20th century produced, and their culture reflects the kind of toughness that is not performed toughness but the real thing, earned in difficult places. Sentiment is not something they trade in openly. But James had been with these men long enough to know that the formal surface of a military unit contains a great deal of genuine human feeling that moves beneath it like water under ice, present and powerful and not visible until something happens to change the conditions. What was happening beneath the surface of the regiment in those months was a quiet, consistent concern for a woman who had become theirs, who had worn their brooch and distributed their shamrocks and taken their salute and said directly and without decoration that she was proud to be their colonel, and who was now absent in circumstances that nobody was discussing fully. The regiment worried about her the way a regiment worries, collectively and silently and without anyone having to name it out loud. Prince William continued his duties during this period with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided that falling apart is not an option that circumstances permit. James had watched him at close proximity enough times to be able to read something of what lay beneath the composure, and what he read in those months was something that he recognized from his own experience, the look of a person doing the next necessary thing and, then, the next necessary thing and, not allowing themselves to look too far ahead because too far ahead is where the fear lives. William brought George, Charlotte, and Louis to engagements where it made sense to bring them and managed those appearances with the care of a father who was thinking about his children's well-being at every moment, calibrating the public exposure against what they could handle, what was good for them, what the situation required. He was the protector and guardian of his family in these months in a way that James found genuinely moving without ever allowing himself to say so, a way that operated entirely in the practical register of doing the actual work of protection, not the symbolic kind but the daily, tireless, unglamorous kind. March came and went without Catherine. The colonel's review for Trooping the Color came and went without her, and her letter to the regiment was read and honored and kept, and the men who had served under her felt her absence as an absence the way you feel the absence of something that has become part of the regular structure of your days. James was present for the colonel's review in his official capacity, and he stood in his position on a day that was missing its central figure and did his job and kept the stillness and felt, beneath the stillness, something that he would have described, if pressed, as loyalty, the kind that is not required by a contract but is given anyway, given because the person who has earned it honestly. The news in June changed things. Catherine appeared at Trooping the Color, the great annual celebration of the monarch's birthday, the most spectacular of all the ceremonial occasions that the British calendar contains, and she appeared not as a person doing their duty through difficulty but as a person who was genuinely present, who had made it through something serious enough that her presence was a statement in itself. She rode in a carriage with her children, and the crowds that had come to see the parade responded to her appearance with the kind of sound that is not a polite clap but something more elemental, a sound of relief and welcome and genuine collective feeling. James was in his position on the route and he heard that sound and felt it in his chest and stood perfectly still because that is what his job required and felt something perfectly still inside him too, something that had been holding tension quietly for months easing by a degree. She had been fighting something serious. That much was becoming clear, though the details remained private, as they should, as they had every right to remain. What was clear was that she was fighting it with a composure and a determination that the regiment, watching from the institutional distance of official events and official channels, could see and respect and recognize as the same quality they had been watching in her for years, the quality of someone who does not give the show away, who takes the difficult thing and carries it without requiring an audience for the carrying. James had spent 16 years in a military institution that valued precisely this quality above almost every other. It was the first quality they trained for. It was the last quality that distinguished the soldiers who held the line in genuinely difficult situations from the ones who discovered they could not. Watching Catherine move through her illness with the same composure she brought to everything else was not, to James, the performance of strength that some people described it as from the outside. It was the real thing. He had seen the real thing often enough to know it when it was in front of him. September was when she spoke publicly. She had finished her chemotherapy. She released a statement and a photograph, both of them in the register that had become her register in these months, honest and warm and direct and careful with language in a way that suggested she had thought hard about every word and chosen each one with the understanding that it would land in very different places for very different people. She spoke of the months as a period of enormous learning and reflection, not a framing that was evasive but one that was true in the specific way that difficult experiences are true, in the sense that they do change you, in ways you cannot entirely predict or control, and that the change is not all loss. She spoke of looking forward to returning to her work and her life with renewed energy and hope. James read the statement in the morning before his run and ran 5 miles in the dark feeling lighter than he had felt in months, which he noted and, then, said nothing about to anyone. October brought her back to official duties, and her first engagement was not a ceremonial one, not a parade or a gala or the kind of glittering occasion that photographs well and requires a specific dress and a specific hat and the specific face you put on for something enormous and symbolic. Her first engagement was a meeting with the families of the victims of the Southport stabbings, a visit to sit with people who had lost someone in circumstances of senseless violence, a meeting that required not ceremony but presence, not pageantry but the same quality that had moved a little girl's face in Delhi 8 years earlier. James was not present for this engagement. He heard about it through the channels by which he heard about things, and what he heard was that she had stayed longer than planned, that the families had spoken about her afterward with the kind of warmth that is not courtesy but genuine gratitude, that she had listened, and that listening was what they had needed. The St. Patrick's Day parade in 2025 was the one that James would tell people about for years, the one that became a moment in a story about more than just a parade. Catherine had been absent from the parade in 2024. She came back in 2025 on her own, without William, and she stood before the regiment she had been given and that she had earned and she took the salute and she distributed the shamrocks with her own hands to every officer and every guardsman who filed past her and she distributed a sprig to Seamus, the regiment's Irish wolfhound mascot, With the particular kind of delight that is not performed delight, because no camera angle makes delight at a dog in a military parade look more dignified than it is, and she was simply delighted by the dog because the dog was enormous and it was wearing shamrocks and she was 33 months post-surgery and she was their colonel and she was back. James stood in his position. Around him, the public who had come to watch the parade stood in their own positions along the barrier. He became aware, at a certain moment as she moved along the line of guardsmen, of a change in the quality of the crowd. Not a sound, exactly. A movement. He looked along the barrier line and saw it spreading, person by person, the way a wave spreads across water when a stone has been dropped into it. People were standing up. Not because they had been asked to. Not because protocol required it. Because she was there, because she had come back, and because something in the sight of her moving down that line of soldiers in the March cold, doing her job with the same total attentiveness she had always brought to it, moved them to their feet in a response that was too instinctive and too unanimous to be anything other than genuine. The video of this moment would later circulate online and be watched hundreds of thousands of times with a single word as its caption. The word was respect. James watched it happen from his position. He kept his face composed. He did not stand up because he was already standing, had been standing for hours, would go on standing for hours more, which is what his job required of him. But he felt something pass through him in that moment, something that had the quality of completion, of a thing that has been building for a long time arriving at what it was always building toward. He thought about his grandfather's uniform. He thought about the word that had moved through him at 7 years old when he pressed his small hand against it. Duty, he had named it then, though he had not known enough yet to know what the word contained. He knew now. Duty was this. Not the standing still in the cold, though it was that too. Not the years of training and the years of service and the parades and the medals and the formal occasions and the informal ones. It was all of that, and it was also the thing that moved a crowd to their feet without anyone asking them to move, the recognition of something worth recognizing, the natural and unstoppable response of human beings to witnessing genuine service and genuine character and genuine care. He would tell this story later. Not right away. Not that day or that week or even that year. But, eventually, in the way that people eventually tell the stories that have found their permanent address inside them, he would tell it, and the people who heard it would understand, without him having to explain anything more than the basic facts, what it meant. A woman came back from something very hard and stood in the cold and handed out shamrocks to soldiers who loved her for it, and the strangers watching from behind a barrier rose to their feet without anyone telling them to, because that is what human beings do when they see someone being entirely and honestly and without reservation themselves, and that self is worth the seeing. In the months after March 2025, James watched Catherine return to her work with the specific quality of someone who has reordered their priorities through necessity and found the reordering useful. She was present in a way that was different from before, harder to define but immediately perceptible to anyone who had been watching closely for long enough. There was a directness to her now, an ease that was not the ease of someone with nothing at stake but the ease of someone who has decided what matters and is acting accordingly, not worrying about the rest. She visited schools and hospitals and charities. She attended events connected to the causes she had given years to, mental health support, early childhood development, the complex and unglamorous work of trying to understand what human beings need in their earliest years to become the kind of people who can bear their lives with some degree of flourishing rather than mere survival. She went to the Royal Marsden Hospital, where she had received her treatment, and sat with people who were receiving their own treatment, and the photographs from that visit showed a woman with her hand on someone's arm and her face in the full expression of attentiveness, nothing held back, nothing performed. James tracked these visits in the way that soldiers track the movements of people they have committed to protect, not as an act of sentiment but as an act of professional attention, which is sometimes also an act of something else, something that does not have a clean military name but that is also part of the job, the part that nobody trains you for and nobody talks about and everybody who has served for long enough carries without making a sound about it. He was proud of her. He was proud of the regiment for having her. He was proud in the specific and uncomplicated way that comes from watching someone do the right thing consistently and, well, over a long period of time, without requiring the doing of it to be recognized or applauded or explained. The recognition and the applause came anyway, as they tend to do when someone is genuinely worth recognizing and applauding, but they came as a consequence rather than a goal, which is the only way they mean anything. Prince William, meanwhile, continued to be the thing that James had long since concluded he was, which was not the dramatic or headline-producing thing that the world sometimes tried to make him, but the thing that is much harder and much less glamorous and much more important, which is a man who shows up every day and does the next necessary thing and loves his family with a care that is visible in every small decision, in which engagements to attend and which to skip, in which moments to put the children in front of the cameras and which to protect from them, in the quiet steadiness of his presence beside his wife as she moved through her recovery and back into her public life. He was described by those who studied him in the language of psychology and public commentary as a protector, a guardian, a calming influence. James would have described him in simpler language. He was a man who understood what he was supposed to do and did it. The regiment held a ceremony in late 2025, an internal occasion without cameras, where awards and commendations were given to members who had served with distinction. James received one. He stood in front of his commanding officer and received it with the composure that he had spent 17 years cultivating and felt, beneath the composure, the full and uncomplicated pleasure of having his work seen and acknowledged by people whose judgment he trusted. After the ceremony, the men gathered in the way that soldiers gather after such occasions, not quite formally and not quite informally, with drinks and the comfortable noise of people who have worked together long enough to have real things to say to each other. James stood with his glass and listened to the conversations around him and thought about the shape of the 17 years behind him, the particular country they had been, its terrain and its weather and the landmarks along the way. There is a particular quality that belongs to old soldiers and nobody else. You can see it in the way they carry themselves, in the distribution of weight, in the economy of movement that comes from having learned through long experience that unnecessary expenditure of energy is a form of disrespect to the work. James Callaghan carried it at 35 the way men much older than him carried it, not because he was aging fast but because the Irish Guards had given him something that accelerates a certain kind of growing up, the kind that is about understanding rather than years, about having seen enough to know what matters and what doesn't. About having stood in enough difficult situations to be able to stand in them without being frightened of standing. He was 35 years old in 2025. He had been a guardsman for 17 years. He had been alive long enough to know that 17 years is both a lot of time and no time at all, which is the kind of paradox that only becomes visible after you have lived enough to see it. In January 2025, Catherine, Princess of Wales, appeared at the Royal Marsden Hospital. Not for treatment this time. She had finished her treatment. She appeared as someone who had been through that particular valley and come out the other side, and she was there to sit with people who were still in it, who were in the middle of their own version of what she had been through, and her presence in that hospital was not a ceremonial presence and was not a photo opportunity in the way that phrase is usually meant. It was the presence of someone who had earned the right to sit in that room not because of her title but because of what she had experienced, and she used that presence in the specific way that only experience can be used, which is to say she sat with people who were afraid and she did not pretend that there was nothing to be afraid of and she did not offer the kind of cheerfulness that is really just the wish that someone else's difficulty would resolve itself so that your own discomfort about being near it could end. She sat with the difficulty and, she said, without putting it in those words exactly but, in a way that was unmistakable, that the difficulty was survivable, that she was evidence of that, and, that being here, being present, being alive in a place where people were fighting for that aliveness, was the most important thing she could do. James heard about this visit in the way he heard about things that were not his direct assignment, through the channels of his professional life, through conversations, through the official record. He heard that she had confirmed, during that visit, that she was in remission. He heard the word remission and felt the specific release that comes from a concern that has been held for a long time finally being given permission to put itself down. Remission. He said the word to himself once in the morning and then went for his run and noticed that the gray January streets felt somehow less gray, which was not a rational response to a medical announcement but which was a human one and which he allowed himself without apology. The year stretched out ahead with the particular quality of years that follow hard ones, years that feel lighter for the comparison, years in which ordinary things have the enhanced quality of things you were not sure you would get to keep. The regiment prepared for St. Patrick's Day with its usual precision. The bearskins were maintained. The uniforms were inspected. The shamrocks were arranged. James was assigned to his position in the ceremonial proceedings, the same kind of position he had stood in for years, important and invisible in equal measure, the position of a man who is doing his job well enough that no one needs to think about whether he is doing it. Catherine came to the parade in March 2025 as a woman who had come through something and was standing on the other side of it without pretending the crossing had been easy, but also without wearing the crossing as her defining characteristic, which would have been forgivable and which she chose not to do. She wore a long bottle green coat. The shamrock brooch sat at her lapel as it always did on this occasion, the old gold brooch that had been worn by the Queen Mother before her, that carried the particular weight of things that have passed through many hands and gathered meaning at each pair of hands. She moved through the ceremony with the ease of someone who was exactly where they intended to be, who had prepared for this, who had decided to be present here in the fullest possible way and was executing that decision without visible effort. The soldiers moved past her in their lines. She gave each man his shamrock. She spoke the small words that the moment required, the words that are not recorded anywhere but that the men who receive them remember, because a person who is genuinely paying attention when they speak to you is speaking something that enters differently than the words of someone going through motions. Seamus the wolfhound received his shamrocks and accepted the proceedings with the enormous, shaggy dignity of an animal who has been doing this for long enough to understand that the shamrocks are the point and the humans are the ceremony and that his job is to stand there and be magnificent, which he did. She laughed at the dog. Real laughter, the kind that involves your whole face and doesn't organize itself for the cameras. The cameras caught it anyway. James stood in his position and watched. He was watching in the dual way he always watched at ceremonial occasions, the alert professional scan for anything that required action, the thing running underneath it that was not professional but human, the thing that took note and held note and would keep note long after the day was over. The crowd was large. The march cold was considerable. The sound of the regiment's drums had started the way it always started, low and building, and it had done the thing it always did to the hairs on James's arms. The world was large and complicated and full of difficulty, and here in this barracks yard there was a woman standing before a regiment in the cold with shamrocks in her hands, doing the thing she had been given to do, and doing it with every part of herself. He saw the crowd rise. He has described it afterward, in the small circle of people he eventually trusted with his memories of that day, as the most moving thing he witnessed in 17 years of service, not the ceremonies, not the parades that had stopped tourists in their tracks, not the occasions that filled column inches and broadcast time and the collective memory of a nation. This. A crowd rising to its feet without being asked, in the cold, in a barracks yard, for a woman walking down a line of soldiers with shamrocks in her hands. He kept his face composed. He did his job. He felt the thing he felt and he filed it in the place where the most important things lived in. He went on with his day. After the parade, there was the traditional gathering in the barracks. Catherine joined a number of soldiers for a drink in the way she had made a practice of joining people, not at a remove, not with the kind of visible awareness of being watched that turns a drink into a performance, but actually joining, standing with a glass of Guinness and talking to the men and listening to the men and being a person among persons in a way that the senior officer in her would not have been required to do and the human in her did anyway. A senior guardsman stood and proposed a toast to Her Royal Highness. The sound that came up from the room was uncomplicated. James was there. He raised his glass. He thought, briefly and with great precision, about his grandfather. His grandfather had told him once about a visit, decades earlier, when a member of the royal family had come to an event connected to the regiment and had shaken hands with the men in a way that was clearly a task being completed, a box being ticked, a duty discharged without the inner life of the person discharging it anywhere near the proceeding. He had told James this story not with bitterness but with the matter-of-fact clarity of a man reporting weather conditions. It was cold. That was what it was like. It was not always like that. When it was not like that, you knew. There was no possibility of mistaking the real thing for the other kind. James had heard that story at 7 or 8 years old and stored it with the other important things. He had lived long enough now to know what his grandfather had meant. He raised his glass in the barracks room in March 2025, surrounded by soldiers who served their country and loved their regiment, and he drank to the woman who had made the real thing her practice and kept it her practice through years of scrutiny and difficulty and the particular challenge of being a human person who was required to be a public symbol at the same time, and, he felt, drinking that Guinness in the company of his regiment, that he had been given something rare in a life. Which is the chance to be near greatness of the specific kind that does not announce itself but is simply there, doing its work, day after day, in the cold and, in the warmth and, in the years that contain both. January 2025 had brought more than remission and, the return of a colonel who mattered. It had brought something smaller but, equally significant, at least to James, which was a public statement from Prince William on the occasion of Catherine's 43rd birthday that broke, quietly and, entirely, from the tradition of royal reserve that had governed the expression of private feeling in public for as long as most people could remember. He had written, "To the most incredible wife and mother. The strength you have shown over the last year has been remarkable. George, Charlotte, Louis and I are so proud of you." He had signed it with his personal W. A royal historian had described this as breathtaking, a breaking of the stiff upper lip mentality that had defined the institution for generations. James had read the statement and thought, in terms much simpler than those of royal historians but equally accurate, that it sounded like a man who had watched his wife do something extraordinary and could not say so. The word strength. The word remarkable. The word proud, coming from a man who had been beside her through the whole of it, who had done his own extraordinary thing in staying steady and present and doing the next necessary thing for the duration, using that word about her. James found the statement more moving than its length should have allowed. He recognized in it the same quality he had been watching in both of them for years, the quality of people who take seriously what they have been given and give it back in full. The middle months of 2025 brought more of the work. Catherine appeared at Trooping the Colour again, this time taking a more prominent position on the dais at Horse Guards Parade, sitting beside King Charles and Queen Camilla rather than in the separate position she had occupied in earlier years. She wore a coat in a shade of blue that had a specific name and a specific meaning, St. Patrick's blue, the shade of the Order of St. Patrick, the shade that appeared in the hackle of the Irish Guards bearskins. The choice was not accidental. It was never accidental with her. She was saying something, in the language of a person who has learned to speak through carefully chosen objects and colors and gestures as well as through words, and what she was saying was that she was the colonel of the Irish Guards and she was proud of it and it was woven into who she was now, and she carried it even when she was sitting beside a king on a dais at the nation's most spectacular ceremony, not for the cameras but because it was true. The Irish Guards official Instagram account shared a photograph of her in that blue coat with a single caption. No words. Just a green heart emoji. James saw it and felt the smile that he did not allow to fully appear on his face while he was in uniform but that lived at the corners of his eyes where it was less visible. He had been thinking, in those middle months of 2025, about what he would do with the years ahead. 17 years in, he was at a point that many soldiers reach, the point where the question of what comes next requires an actual answer rather than a deferral. He could serve for many more years. The regiment would have him. He was good at the work and the work was good for him and there was more road ahead in the direction he had been traveling. But, he had also been thinking, with the particular seriousness that comes from having watched people give their public lives to important work, about whether there was something else he was supposed to do, some other form the second chapter of a life in service might take. He had not resolved this question. He was not in a hurry to resolve it. He held it the way he had learned to hold difficult things, with patience and, without forcing, trusting that the answer would arrive when it was ready. In the autumn of 2025, something happened that gave the question a different quality. He was assigned to the ceremonial detail for a visit Catherine made to a women's prison in connection with a charity she supported, Action for Children. It was not a glamorous assignment. Women's prisons are not glamorous places, and the work that happens in them is the slow, complicated, resistant work of trying to build something in conditions designed for other purposes. Catherine moved through the visit with the same quality she brought to everything, the full attention, the genuine interest, the readiness to sit with difficulty without trying to move past it too quickly. She spoke with women who were serving sentences, women whose lives had gone in directions they had not chosen, women who were in the particular position of having to build something out of something broken. She spoke with women who had received support from the charity and who had come back to speak about it, and James watched their faces as they spoke to her and saw on those faces the particular expression of people who have been seen, actually seen, by someone whose seeing matters. After the visit, in the brief window between the official proceedings ending and the departure, Catherine spoke briefly to James in the casual, half-personal way she sometimes spoke to members of the detail she had seen enough times to have a sense of as individuals. She asked how he was. He said he was well. She said it was a good day's work. He agreed that it was. She said something, almost to herself as much as to him, about how the work you do in the small places, the places no camera follows and no press release describes, is the work that matters most, and that she found it easier to understand why she was doing any of this when she was here, in a room like this, with people like these women, than when she was on a red carpet or at a ceremony, and she said this not with complaint but with the clarity of a person who has worked something out about themselves that they are glad to have worked out. James agreed, and he meant it, and she received his agreement with the naturalness of someone who was not surprised to find that a person in his position might have views worth the receiving. He thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. He thought about what she had described, the gap between the formal and the real, the way that the public surface of a life and service is not the same thing as the life and service itself, and how the people who do this work best are the ones who have found their way back, again and again, to the real thing beneath the formal surface, the people, the conversations, the rooms without cameras, the faces of the women in that prison whose lives were complicated in ways that no ceremony resolves. But that actual human presence, actual attention, actual care, can touch. He thought about his grandfather's garden and his mother's lavender and the uniform in the wardrobe and the 7-year-old boy who had felt something move through him that he could not name. He thought he was closer to naming it now than he had ever been. It was not duty, exactly, though it was that too. It was not loyalty, though it was that too. It was something that came before both of those words, something that the words were trying to point toward without quite reaching. It was the recognition that some things are worth giving yourself to. That service, the real kind, is not about the giving up of something but about the finding of something, the way that giving yourself to something larger than yourself is not a loss but a discovery that you are large enough to contain the giving and that the giving makes you larger still. He had been discovering this for 17 years. The regiment had been the form the discovery took. The people he had served, all of them but some of them in particular, had been the teachers. He thought about William in a room in India, laughing over a carom board with children who had never expected to find themselves sitting across from a prince. He thought about Catherine in that same room in India, sitting with a girl whose wariness eased by degrees under the force of genuine attention. He thought about the regiment in the cold of March, year after year, and the shamrocks and the drums and the wolfhound and the brooch that had passed from hand to hand for decades carrying its cargo of continuity and care. He thought about a crowd rising to its feet in a barracks yard without anyone asking them to, because what they were seeing was the real thing and the real thing moves people whether they intend to be moved or not. He thought about what it meant to earn respect. Not the respect that comes automatically with a title, the kind that people give because they are required to and would give equally to anyone occupying the same position. The other kind. The kind that is given because a person has done the work, day after day, in the full light of public scrutiny and in the rooms where no cameras follow, and has brought the same quality of self to both, the same attentiveness, the same care, the same refusal to perform what they could instead simply be. He had watched this quality demonstrated over nearly 2 decades, first at a distance and then at closer range, and he had watched it demonstrated not just in the single large gesture that makes the headlines but in the texture of thousands of small moments that together amount to a life. He had made a decision. He was going to serve for as long as the regiment needed him, and, when the time came for the next thing, he would approach it with the understanding he had been given, which is that service does not have a single form, that the skills developed in 17 years of standing straight in difficult conditions translate to other forms of standing straight in difficult conditions, and that the country was full of rooms where someone was needed to be present and attentive and to care without requiring the caring to be witnessed. He did not know what those rooms would be. He trusted that he would find them. On a morning in late 2025, James Callahan ran his 5 miles in the dark before the city woke up. He came back to the flat with the window that didn't close quite right and the smell of damp and London autumn coming through the gap, and he made his tea and stood at the window and looked at the street below. It was quiet at that hour. The city was mostly still. He thought about his grandfather, who had stood in this regiment before him, who had told him stories that he had not fully understood until years later, who had put a uniform in a wardrobe for a 7-year-old boy to find and feel the pull of. He thought about the chain of people who had stood where he stood, who had done this work before him and would do it after him, who had found their way to this particular form of service through the particular country of their own lives and had held the line while they were here. He thought about a princess who had been given a regiment and earned it. He thought about a prince who had stood beside her through everything with the steadiness of someone who understood what he was there for. He thought about the men of the Irish Guards, the mini-mix from Northern Ireland, the veterans with the weathered faces, the young soldiers finding their feet, all of them part of something that had started before any of them and would continue after all of them, as long as there were people willing to give themselves to it honestly. He thought about the crowd that had risen to its feet in March, unprompted, in the cold, and he thought that this was perhaps the whole story, told in a single image. A woman doing her work in a barracks yard. Strangers rising to honor what they were seeing. A soldier standing straight in his position, composure intact, something full and unmistakable in the chest that no uniform requirement and no training protocol and no professional necessity required him to feel, but that was there regardless, had always been there, would always be there, because some things are not about requirements. Some things are about who you are, and who you choose to be, and who you have been given the extraordinary privilege of standing next to while they show you, day after day and year after year, exactly what those words mean. He drank his tea. The city began to wake up. James Callahan set the cup down, straightened his back out of old habit, and went to get ready for the day. The regiment was waiting. The work was waiting. And the work, as it always had been, as it would always be, was more than enough.